Peace to the tribe, man. We in here. Y'all already know what it is. We're about to get into some literature, into some history, man. Y'all already know what time it is. Y'all travel with me, I'm traveling with you. Let's do it. We gonna get into it today, family, you hear me? Shout out to the tribe, man. Y'all already know what it is, man. Knowledge is born, you hear me? The tribe is doing good. I hope everybody is blessed. My bad, let me turn this audio down to make sure everything is good, man. But I hope everybody is good. Everybody is doing well. Family is well. A lot going on out in the world. A lot of people losing their lives. A lot of people losing their opportunities. A lot of people losing careers. But if you're strong enough, you know that standing next to you is strong enough, you can and you will prevail. We're going to get into it, man. Got some history I want to share with y'all later on, man. We're gonna rock to it, you hear me? Gonna rock to it. We're gonna get into it because this is some deep shit. I told y'all I'm gonna keep trying to bring you this knowledge and the things that we need in order to make it to where we need to go, you understand me? So, when you get up in here, man, like or dislike the stream, man, whichever you choose to do is all solely on you. We're gonna give it some vibes, let it rock for a couple minutes. And we gonna go in. You hear me? See, I already know time this video. Y'all tuned in. We in here. the papers with the gobble, you hear me? Smoke it on some good, y'all right? Sing it. But y'all smoke it all, y'all from, drop it. You hear me? Yo, show some love to the stream, man. Hit that like button, man. That dislike button is gonna get it in the algorithm either way, man. Just don't come in here and snipe a stream, you hear me? Let's get it going. Let's get it going. You feel what I'm saying? Let's do it, man. Y'all in here, man, with the chief, man. Urban Indian, man. Chief Legend, man. We here, man. You feel me? So, let's get it done, man. Y'all ready the vibes. Let's do it. Yo, peace to the fam, peace to the motherfucking tribe. We are live. We about to go in. I got this PDF I want to share with y'all, man. It's a beautiful thing, bro. Discussing Indian relationships and the Indian experiences and things that was related to the government that we had went through as Indians. All you gotta do is listen. I got it to where it's set up to it's gonna read it to you and you just gotta listen along, but it's some deep shit in here. Respect to Wilma Mankiller. That's a funny name, that last name and shit like that. I get it though, I ain't tweaking, I get it. But yeah, we're gonna get into it, man. I'm gonna go ahead and set this audio up so we can delve into it, and we gonna do it, bro. You feel me? And that's how it goes.
American Indians. Afternoon concurrent breakout session November 14th. Exploring the legacy and future of Black Indian relations moderator Wilma Mankiller. With Dr. Willard. critical to build coalitions with
Hold on right quick, y'all. Let me get it right. I got some difficulties jumping off. Let me get it right. I'm gonna have to leave my mic unmuted because it's not, for some reason, it's not picking up the audio. So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna leave that unmuted. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna run it back. We gonna get it right. We gonna get it right. We gonna get it right. Promise.
57th Annual Session, National Congress of American Indians. Afternoon concurrent breakout session November 14th. Exploring the legacy and future of Black Indian Relations moderator Wilma Mankiller. With Dr. Willard R. Johnson, Dr. Daniel F. Littlefield Jr., Dr. Patrick Minges, Ms. Deborah Tucker, Dr. David Wilkins. Chief Wilma Mankiller. I became interested in the relationships and the connections between Native American and African American people many years ago. I learned from the national news about the struggle against apartheid in Africa. I knew there were a lot of political organizations, but I really didn't put it together until I read Achebe's story about an individual family, an individual community, and the destruction of the people. The situation was strikingly similar to what has happened to native people in this country. It is almost as if the colonizers had a little black book that they used to colonize the people as they went around the world. They took away the leaders, destroyed their medicine, destroyed the governmental system, sent the kids away to distant schools and, in the case of Africa, to French and other European schools, and in our case, to government boarding schools, the native boarding school. That piqued my interest, and I have been interested in these issues since that time. I later found that there were many connections in this country between African Americans and Native Americans, some positive and some not so positive. In some of the large southeastern tribes, the mixed blood population was slaveholders, and there was and continues to be what I would describe as almost a class system in the southeastern tribes. And by and large the full-blood people were absolutely opposed to holding of human beings in bondage. And so we have that history. On the other hand, we have a history of a great deal of intermarriage. We have a history of our people joining abolitionists in their struggle. It is a complicated history. It is important for us to talk about that a little bit today and think about it. Our issues and theirs. Sometimes our issues are not the same as theirs. In the 70s and the late 60s I had a great deal of trouble explaining to my friends who were working in the civil rights movement that while the civil rights movement tried to help people gain entry into the system, we were fighting for the right to have our own system. And so sometimes we need to understand our different issues here, and talk to one another about those issues so that we can support their civil right issues and they can support our issues to retain our separate tribal government and our traditional way of life. Coalitions are important. The other reason it is important is because there are a couple of issues in Indian country now, where things that happen to African American people happen to all of us. For example, in the case of the Pequots, with the Benedict book, and the fact that the Pequot Nation is being challenged in the federal recognition process, is about racism, not just about questioning their ancestry. Society tends to accept tribal people when mixed. With white people, without any problem whatsoever. If you meet someone who says I am half white and half Yakama, or half white and half Oneida, or whatever, people tend to accept those people. But if you find someone who says I am half black and half Oneida, Yakama, or Cherokee, people have more difficulty with that. That is the reality of the time that we live in. And, I believe, watching this issue from afar, that is what is driving the issue of the Pequots. Part of it is greed, just plain old greed, in envy of their financial success, and part of it is racism. There is another issue that I hope Daniel Littlefield will touch on, which is the current issue of freed slaves who generally were a class of citizens, described as freedmen. And I mean citizens, they were full citizens in the Seminole Nation, until recently. There were two bands that participated fully in the Seminole Nation until very recently, and then in July in the year 2000, there was a tribal vote and they were excluded from further participation in the Seminole Nation. Which raises a couple of questions. It raises two issues that I think are important for people to talk about. One, the tribal right, which tribes have fought for since the beginning of contact, to determine who is their membership. Two, the civil and human rights of the freedmen. And to bring together these very different issues, they are sort of at a juncture, and I think that we are going to see these issues arise more often. And finally, I am not a scholar of this issue. I think this is an issue we need to talk about, and that is why I got scholars to talk about this issue, because I react emotionally, rather than intellectually. One of the things that struck me in going to the South, the last NCAI Congress was in Myrtle Beach, was that I saw people who appeared to be African American, who I could absolutely look at and say, that person is Creek, or that person is Cherokee. And I saw 3 or 4 people like that, and I thought that the whole area of family connections between African Americans and Native Americans was very interesting, and we should have a dialogue about it. Anyway, that is where we are, and that is what got us here. I have sort of abused the prerogative of the moderator. I am sounding too much like a retired MIT professor. Laughter. So I'm going to start with Willard Johnson. Willard had a very distinguished career at MIT. But I have known Willard in another capacity. His wife, Vivian, and I were both on the board, in the 60s and 70s, of an organization called Rainbow Television, and, just to show you what we thought when we were young, we thought that we were going to change the perception of minorities in this country, through television. And so, we had our own television group and went to Hollywood. And you can tell how well we did, because you never heard of it. Laughter. Willard Johnson was very involved in the anti-apartheid movement. He was one of the authors of some books, published by the Ford Foundation, that laid the basis and determined what ultimately became the reconciliation agreement that brought South Africa to democracy. He also started the Kansas Institute of African American and Native American Family History, the KIAANAFH. And so, with that I will let him begin. Dr. Willard R. Johnson. Thank you, Chief Mankiller. I am very honored by your introduction. I should make sure you introduce me to whatever program in which I may participate. Thank you so very much. The first question that we have to think about, that you see on the little program handout, was, what is this relationship historically? And, because I am not a scholar on this, I will speak more from my experience as an African American and through the Kansas Institute's work with families, to say that I will make 3 points. The first point I would like to talk about is kinship, in the sense of the relationship being one of kinfolk. The second point, which I will come back to, has to do with a relationship of slavery. Those two interact, but with Native Americans they interacted somewhat differently than they did with white Americans. Somewhat. And the third point has to do with comrades in arms. There are a number of ways in which blacks and Indians had collaborated and in some cases have been in conflict with each other. So, kinship, slavery, and comrades in arms. On the kinship side, it's a question of a memory that is very, very widespread, and sometimes clear, among African American families. I would say that, by far, the majority of African American families I know, or that I have come into contact with and have worked with, claim to have an Indian connection. A majority, by far. Some scholars have argued that maybe up to 2/3, or even 3/4 of black Americans have some native blood tie. I wouldn't go that far, but I say that the memory is clear in some cases, fuzzy in others. You have some very noted cases, Tiger Woods, who has most recently brought the issue of a complex background for African Americans into sharper focus. Della Reese, Jesse Jackson, Alice Walker, a close personal friend of Chief Mankiller and a person with Cherokee ties, are others. Those are very noted cases, and no doubt those are documented cases. We often came across families that could remember the tie, and insist on it, but it was a fuzzy memory when it came to documentation. And often, we would get the story from families in the South and Midwest, oh yes, we have an Indian tie, it was Blackfoot. Well, it was not Blackfoot, you know. That tribe was far away in Montana and so forth, far from where blacks were. So, we just took that to mean that there was some kind of Indian connection, and they didn't really know what it was. That is the clearer side of the memory, actually. The foggy side, and often even close to amnesia side of it, was that this connection also involved slavery. In my own family, we had been told stories about my great-great-grandfather as a Cherokee. And only much later did I find that he had Cherokee rights of citizenship as a freedman. It doesn't mean that he could not have had blood ties. But I doubt it because he never claimed to. And it was much easier to get whatever rights there were through blood ties, than simply from freedman ties. But we also have a very famous case of Dr. John Hope Franklin, one of our most eminent American historians, whose great-great-grandfather was in fact married to a Choctaw. His family had every right to be on the rolls of the Choctaw by blood ties. But they are not there. You go and look at the record, they are only on the freedman roll. He tells the story of how that came to be. But very few African Americans remember that the connections came through slavery with the Indians, that they were slaves of Indians. And this is an important dimension of the relationship. The final aspect of what was the relationship, and I will come back to the other questions about what are the interests involved and what is at stake. And the question, where is all of this headed, was the dimension of comrade in arms. We have two important experiences about this in the work of my institute. Well, one of them is more of a personal concern. Closing parenthesis. The first comes directly from the Institute's program, what I call the Great Escape of Creeks, mostly, but also lots of Shawnee, Seminoles and some Cherokee were involved, in fleeing from Confederacy-controlled Indian Territory into Kansas. They were referred to in the history texts as the Loyal Indians. Hundreds and hundreds of blacks joined him, and I am led to believe that was because word got up that, in fact, a promise had been made that if they stuck together and made it to Kansas, that would end slavery among them. And, as far as I can see, through the record, and we can debate it, that was a promise made and a promise kept. And it wasn't simply the imposition in the treaty negotiations in 1866 that put citizenship rights into the books. There was also the earlier episode with the Seminoles, the rise of the Seminole Nation in Florida as a comrade in arms collaboration. between people who had escaped from the U.S., Georgia, Alabama, the Carolinas, into what was not the U.S., namely Florida. They were mostly Creeks, but included lots and lots of Africans. And the rise of that tribe, you can't say that there was no Seminole identity at all, separate and apart from the blacks, but their rise and survival, and their later history, was intimately connected. It is a story of an intimate comrade in arms relationship between those two peoples. So, we were very touched, very deeply troubled, deeply, by this most recent move among the Seminoles of Oklahoma to expel the two freedmen bands. So, it is a memory of kinship, fuzzy and clear, and it's a fact of slavery, but it's also a fact of, having been comrades in arms, that is a very important part of the story of the survival, in some cases, of Indian culture, as well as the origin of the only reparations, actually, blacks have gotten in terms of land. The 40 acres and a mule never came from the federal government. The only 40 acres blacks ever got came from the Indians. Dr. Daniel F. Littlefield, Jr. I formulated some more general kinds of statements about the first question, and I was looking at the nature of the relationship between African Americans and American Indians in the long scope of history, and I came up with 5 generalized points that I would like to make, and then we can pursue these later in the question and answer, if you want that in more detail. The first thing I would point out is that this relationship is long-standing. As the historical record suggests, from the first contact with Spanish in the Western Hemisphere, there was contact between African Americans and American Indian people. It became a factor, that relation became a factor in tribal politics and international relations and intertribal relations as early as the 18th century. And from that point on to the present, it has remained an issue in American Indian affairs. Secondly, I would say that that relationship was shaped by the characteristics of slavery as it was practiced by individual tribes. I was asked by the Smithsonian Institution to write a chapter for the last volume of the Handbook on American Indians that it is putting together, on African Indian relations, and I refused to do that because I didn't think it could be done in an overall essay. It needs to be done on a tribal basis. Because the practice of slavery varied widely among the tribes in the Southeast, from something that approximated chattel slavery among some of the Cherokees, Choctaws and Chickasaws to a kind of loose coalition that existed in the Seminole and Creek nations. Also, as Willard mentioned, there was a military alliance that existed for many decades between the Seminoles and African people of African descent, in Florida, before removal to the west, and the military officials in Florida who were fighting that war determined early that it was not an Indian war but a Negro war, in their words. The relationship among those 5 tribes was legalized in the treaty in 1866 and then again in the agreement that the tribes came to with the Dawes Commission. And in enrolling the tribes for allotments, the Dawes Commission made a roll of the freedmen members of all of those tribes. The treaties required that the tribes adopt their former slaves and free blacks as members of the nations. The Cherokees, Creeks and Seminoles adopted theirs immediately, the Chickasaws never did, and the Choctaws did reluctantly in 1885. And those processes of adoptions under the treaties in late 1866 put a particular slant on the day-to-day lifestyle of people of African descent within those tribal nations. How all the freedmen fared under the tribal governments varied widely. As Willard has indicated, the Seminoles created 2 tribal bands for the freedmen. They had equal representation in the National Council along with the 12 Seminole bands. In the Creek Nation there were 3 tribal towns created for the former slaves and free blacks. They had 1 representative in the House of Kings and then 1 representative in the House of Warriors, the lower house of the National Council, plus another member of the National Council for every 200 people in the tribal towns. There was less representation in the Cherokee Nation because the Cherokees elected their members of the National Council at large from the legislative district. So the difference in political power that was wielded within the tribes by freedmen members varied considerably. In the Chickasaw Nation they had no rights whatsoever, legal, civil, educational. In the Choctaw Nation, They had very little participation in tribal governmental affairs after adoption in 1885. The relationship between people of African descent and the tribal nations in the 20th century has been marked by the racism that has informed our society in the 20th century. The federal government built into its structures in Oklahoma, when the tribes were dissolved, a racial factor. The legislature in Oklahoma declared Indians white by law, and then of course the first two bills passed by the state legislature in Oklahoma were Jim Crow bills that segregated people of African descent. This meant that tribal freemen who were admitted under the Treaty of 1866 fell under the segregation laws. So the two groups were on a different track throughout the 20th century, and even here today, I think, we have been hearing the results of that. Chief Mankiller, thank you, Daniel. Daniel Littlefield wrote a number of very important books on the subject, and we hope to post on the NCAI website, after the conference, his suggested readings and films that you can see. I would like to turn next to Dr. David Wilkins. He is a Lumbee, and an authority on federal recognition processes. He is an associate professor of Indian studies at the University of Minnesota, a political scientist, and a specialist on the Lumbee Nation. And most of you know the Lumbees had been trying to get federal recognition for a very long time. I don't think I am one of those people that sees racism in everything that goes on in this country. I try to have a good mind about that, and be open, but I believe that to some extent a part of their battle, their struggle to receive federal recognition, has to do with the fact that a lot of the Lumbee people are tribal people who intermarried with African Americans and other people. So this has made their struggle more difficult. Dr. David Wilkins. Thank you, Wilma. It is my pleasure to be on this august panel, really, and to see the left side of the room fill up. Laughter. It is nice to have some folks on the left, and to have them be young people makes it all the better to discuss this long ignored, really stealth subject, if you will, the relation between African Americans and American Indians. I didn't feel too bad when I heard that my name had been left off the program, when I discovered that some of the conference doings were taking place in an auditorium named for Roy Wilkins. No relation, but he was a powerful and very important African American civil rights leader. I don't know whether it was a coincidence, or fate, or what. Either way, I think it is most appropriate that we are talking about Black and Indian relations, and that there are now two Wilkins on the formal agenda, one a noted civil rights and the other a relatively unknown Lumbee professor. In response to the first question, and the others as well, I can only speak from my own nation's perspective, Lumbee, only from an indirect, impressionistic perspective, because I am no scholar on this field. My area is federal Indian policy, law, and tribal government, and I have Dr. David Wilkins. Thank you, Wilma. It is my pleasure to be on this august panel, really, and to see the left side of the room fill up. Laughter. It's nice to have some folks on the left, and to have them be young people makes it all the better to discuss this long ignored, really stealth subject, if you will, the relation between African Americans and American Indians. I didn't feel too bad when I heard that my name had been left off the program, when I discovered that some of the conference doings were taking place in an auditorium named for Roy Wilkins, no relation, but he was a powerful and very important African American civil rights leader. I don't know whether it was a coincidence, or fate, or what. Either way, I think it is most appropriate that we are talking about Black and Indian relations. Only come to the subject indirectly as I have done my research on my tribe's quest for recognition. But here is where I think my tribe's historical relationship with African Americans, while not exactly comparable with the other Eastern tribes, can nevertheless teach us something about the larger dynamics of Black and Indian relations. And it is this: one of the primary reasons the Lumbees have been denied federal recognition is that we are said, very quietly these days, to exhibit too much of an admixture of non-Indian racial characteristics, with an emphasis being placed almost exclusively on our perceived, and real, mixtures with African Americans. This is interesting, since the documentary and oral evidence of my people points to the Lumbees having intermarried actually more with whites than with African Americans. But, as Wilma noted in her comments, Indian intermarriage, or hanky-panky, if you will, has been acceptable historically, while Indian black involvement, or hanky-panky, was deemed to dilute or to corrupt the tribe's cultural and genetic identity. This is a perverse form of racism, folks. And I think we can all agree upon that. I must say that this is an extremely touchy subject among the Lumbee as well as in other North and South Carolina and Virginia tribes and those in other mid-Atlantic and eastern states. Now, Oklahoma is a whole different world, and we have to talk to Dr. Littlefield about that. No one, to my knowledge, has engaged in any sort of social scientific study about the Lumbee or other non-recognized mid-Atlantic tribes to attain, if it is even possible, what the actual level of Indian-Black interaction has been across time. People just make these grand statements without ever having the research to support it. All we have, in fact, are dangerous guesstimates of some anthros and historians who tend to lump the Lumbee and other tribes into a tri-racial isolate category. That's the major concept that filtered throughout the Southeast. I don't know if that applies in southern Oklahoma or not. How weird. People make generalized and unsubstantiated statements like, the Lumbee have a long history of intermarrying with people of European and African origin. How many tribes, I wonder, have not had a history of intermarrying with other people, regardless of race, ethnicity, or national origin? The Southwest, my wife is Navajo, is a tri-racial isolate of Spanish, Indian, and white. Here in the Great Lakes, French, English, and Indian. And you can mix that up depending on what region of the country you are in. Neither of these allegedly scholarly observations did the Lumbee or other quasi-recognized tribes much good, and they are not very good social science either, since they rarely are backed by empirical data. Such categorical statements tend rather to reinforce existing stereotypes about the Lumbee and other small eastern tribes who always struggled in a legal wonderland, as Indian people denied recognition as such because of existing federal and state policies that historically only recognized two races, black or white, or dealt only with certain tribes, like the Cherokee in North Carolina, because of the territorial location, military capability, and treaty position. In short, the nature of the connection is that of a complicated beast, although it varies from tribe to tribe, region to region, and people to people. Thank you. Dr. Patrick Minges. I guess I am kind of lucky to be up here, but one reason why I am up here is that I was reading a book by Chief Mankiller called The Chief and Her People, and as I was going through this book, it talked about Africans on the Trail of Tears. This piqued my interest, and so I went on to research it, and spent about 10 years on that. One of the places where I ended up was called the Slave Narratives. In the late 1930s, as part of the U.S. federal government's Works Project Administration, they sent researchers to interview people who were formerly slaves, and a certain number of these ex-slaves came from what was called Indian Territory. As I got to studying these narratives, it opened a whole new world for me, and if I may, I would like to read sections from these slave narratives. It is going to be in the vernacular language, from the 19th century, so I'm asking you to forgive me on this. The first is from Jane Gillespie, from the Arkansas Rye Project. My grandparents were Gillespie. My grandmother was an Indian woman. She was sold off the reservation, her and her daughter. The daughter was about 12 years old and big enough to wait tables. Both of them were full-blooded Cherokee Indians. My grandma married a slave, and when she grows up, my mother married a slave. But my mother's parents were both Indians, and one of my parents from my father's side was white. So, you see, I am about 3/4 of something else. But when they were stolen, they were made slaves. And that's what I am. Here is another person, Richard Franklin, from the Oklahoma Writers Project. I was born into the Creek Nation, March 1st, 1856. My mother was named Seymour Franklin. She was 1/4 Creek Indian, and was married to a Negro slave, Fred Franklin, who was the slave of James Yagi of the Creek Nation. I am 1/8 Creek Indian, and 7/8 Negro. My father was born in the Creek Nation, and he, with 9 other slaves, worked on the farm of Yagi in the Creek Nation until 1867, when the Civil War was over. And here is that of Patricia Harriman, taken by the Oklahoma Writers Project. My mother had always been Mistress Judy Taylor. She was from the slave narratives, was a pure-blood Indian. She was born near the Lookout Mountain in Tennessee, on a river in a log hut. They lives in houses, and her father was the Indian chief. His name was Red Bird. They belonged to the Choctaw tribe. The white people was trying to drive him out, in uprising with the whites, and all my mother's folks were killed, but her. The white folks took her and gave her to Dr. Durney. She was big enough to know there was fighting and was trying to drive him out. Her mother's name was Marthy. She remembers they used to have green corn dances. They cooked all their stuff together in a big pot, green corn, butter beans and rabbit and any other animal they kill. And they all eat, and they have a big dance around the pot and they call it the green corn dance. I guess the point I am trying to make is that we have these ideas of this discrete group of Indians, as you have the idea of Africans, and there is the idea that Indians owned Africans. There is not the idea that even into the 19th century, there were Native Americans who were enslaved, who lived their lives in these slave communities. And one of
Yeah.